Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Dr. Moore, as I'm sure we've discussed already, Hurricane Dorian, it was, as we all know, predicted to hit the east coast of Florida. I represent Northeast Florida from Cape Canaveral up to Jacksonville. 3 of the counties in my district, Volusia, Flagler, and St. Johns, went under a mandatory evacuation based on the predictions. Obviously, Dorian never made landfall in Florida, fortunately. This was a huge dilemma and hugely frustrating of when our county officials make those calls to evacuate. You don't want to overreact, but obviously, and to the tune of significant expenditures, but on the other hand, you don't want to underact. And obviously, this is a call that we all have to collectively make every time one of these storms threaten the United States. In this case, bottom line is I don't want to say we dodged a bullet, we dodged a missile. That Category 5 storm could have been absolutely catastrophic, and at one point I think we were looking at Hurricane Andrew, Hurricane Michael, and Hurricane Katrina maybe combined in terms of the original track. I know I personally was hitting the refresh button on the predictions. Probably it seemed like about every 5 minutes. I think NOAA and the National Hurricane Center did as great a job and as good a job as it could informing the public every 3 hours. But can you just take a moment to discuss the primary differences between the models that you use, the European model that we hear so much about and NOAA's? Are there any data points that you would recommend NOAA include or weigh more heavily to improve the accuracy of these models? It seems like in this case the European model was pretty accurate. And if you could just talk to that for a moment, because there are literally millions of lives and treasure that are dependent. It's a great thing that we have it, but how would you and what can we do to help improve it?
Let me make 3 points. First of all, to the emergency managers and NOAA that had to make that call. If anyone doubts why we made the call, or that NOAA made the call, look at what happened to the island offshore, where it did hit, and just project that damage into Florida. And if you had people in harm's way and not being evacuated, it would have been a missile strike. It would have been a missile strike.
Oh, absolutely. And just in the interest of time, I'm not questioning at all the calls that were made. How do we, as we look forward, improve the accuracy of our modeling?
I think what we have to also do is to look at how the Europeans conduct their research. They marshal the best talent across Europe, and they focus that talent really on one model. And they say, this is where we're making our bet. We have tended to focus our talent across many models, and at the same time, we have only used a portion of our scientific talent. In particular, the university community has not been in a position to be as engaged in the development of the next generation of numerical weather prediction. And I hope with the EPIC initiative, and we thank Congress for this, and with the Innovation Act, that there is a recognition that the total United States scientific community, from the social scientists to the physical scientists, have got to be engaged in this grand enterprise.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that answer. Again, in the few minutes I have remaining, and this is for anyone on the panel, Florida and Florida's governor is, I think, leading the way in many ways in naming a chief science officer and naming a chief resiliency officer and trying to look at how we mitigate, but then also how do we respond once we sustain that type of damage, and do we rebuild in smarter ways and more resilient ways than we have in the past. Would anyone care, either for the time I have remaining, or I'd appreciate it for the record, of how we can be more resilient? I think Florida is leading the way post-Hurricane Andrew in wind resiliency, and we need to look at that in terms of flood resiliency with rising seas, with insurance markets, with property valuations. This is critical to the future of our state and the country. And in the few seconds I have remaining, any responses, please?
I'll jump on it, but I think James has some thoughts as well. At the University of Georgia, we've stood up an Institute for Resilient Infrastructure Systems where we're thinking exactly about those, because there is research by Phil Kutzbach and I believe in Roger Pilkey Jr. and others that have shown the infrastructure along coastal regions has increased at the same time we're seeing these extreme events. So there has to be a sustained thought process for thinking about resilience and risk for our infrastructure in these regions.
Yeah, just to build on that, just briefly, some work I did with my colleagues showed that the Florida Building Code is extremely effective against hurricane wind damage, and that's due to the strength of the code and how well it's enforced. And so building that out nationwide would presumably bring similar benefits.
Thank you, and I welcome any other responses for the record. I think this is an incredibly useful conversation.
Water resiliency too, and not just wind.
Absolutely.
Water gets underplayed, not just the surge,
That's right.
the rainfall.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.